What's going on? Happy holidays to all. Hope everyone's enjoying a beautiful holiday with their families and everything. And yeah, it's been like a week since I dropped my last video. And obviously, we know that this is like the most dead time of year to be a UFC fan. It's the most down bad time to be a UFC fan. This is the longest amount of time they've ever gone without putting a UFC event, 6 weeks to be exact. So we're at almost the end of week 5. That means there's exactly 1 month to go till UFC 324. And it's just been a little bit hard lately to obviously make content. Just I think as a whole in the UFC YouTube community, this is the hardest time to be motivated to make content because it's the holidays. There's no UFC, like there's nothing even really to talk about. And specifically for myself too, like we're coming up on actually in February it's gonna be a full year since I made this channel, but like after doing this now for a bunch of months already, like I've seen, what it's like. Because again, in the beginning and this is kind of just a year in review kind of video. As promised, I'm going to be ranking, in my opinion, the worst to best UFC pay-per-views of this year. But specifically for myself, like it's been kind of cool to, try to build up a UFC MMA channel. Like I'm trying to become like one of the next Lucas Tracy's or gurus. But honestly, like when I first made this channel, I said that I would be happy if even 50 to 60 people watch. Like that would be great numbers for me. But I mean, after a time, you do get numb to those numbers, and then you want more and more and more. And I've done some pretty solid videos. Like the largest video I've done, I actually got 2 videos on UFC 319 with Hamza Chimaev. 2 of the videos I covered, like revolving around that card, got over 1,000 views. And I've had multiple videos already. And when I look at like other like MMA YouTube channels, like the underground ones, the ones that really are trying to make it out, like we're doing pretty solid compared to some other like really like low-key channels. But like the biggest thing for me is like it's hard to stay motivated and do this when like there's no like engagement. I'm trying to see some comments. I'm trying to see some engagement with people. Like that's what makes it kind of cool and fun to like hear other people's perspectives on like what they think about the sport and everything. So what I'm trying to say is, right now I've been lacking the motivation to kind of drop more, like, and honestly, like, who gives a fuck, right? Like, I'm just a random, like, underground MMA YouTuber, but if I could even call myself that, but at the end of the day, like, yeah, I'm just looking for more, like, engagement with, there's a good 50 or 60 people, a good 50, 60 of you guys that are tuning in consistently. So for that, try to stay locked in and do more with the YouTube channel. But anyways, enough of that. It's time this is the best I could do right now at the end of the year when there's no UFC, is just to kind of give a ranking on every pay-per-view of UFC 2025. The beginning of this year was really, really underwhelming considering how we were approaching. We went into 2025 thinking we were going to get some crazy massive fights. The Tom Aspinall, John Jones fight, the Topuria Islam Makhachev fight for International Fight Week. All of that did not end up happening in the first couple cards, as you're going to see, as we're going to rank pretty obviously from the worst starting. Like, it was a very weird way to start off the year. And then the year of 2025 ended off really, really strong. The last, like, 4 pay-per-views were, besides UFC 321, but the last few pay-per-views, the UFC really did their thing with it. They cooked. There were some super stacked cards with some great action too and very exciting. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to rank, in my opinion, the worst to best UFC cards of the year. And obviously, I got to start off. Everyone's going to have this on their list as the worst. UFC 3. No, actually, this wasn't even the first card of the year, but yeah, this is the worst one. This was in February, UFC 312 in Sydney, Australia. It was Dricus du Plessis versus Sean Strickland 2. This card was absolutely awful. Besides the main title fight, you had Zhang Wei Li and Tatiana Suarez as a co-main event, and then a bunch of random guys like on the main card, like Jimmy Crute, and no good like of the Australian fighters. This year's 2026's Australia card actually looks like it's going to be really sick, with Volk versus Lopez. Okay, not so crazy about that fight, but then Hooker versus Benoit Saint Denis, Rivazi versus Ruffy, Quillen Salakil's on the card. But this Australia card was absolutely awful. pretty much continued the UFC streak of doing Australia dirty. Just a fight, a rematch we didn't really want to see. Hamzat was coming off the super dominant win versus Robert Whittaker. We all wanted to see that fight. Now, granted, it probably worked out better that they did it in America, but instead of Australia, but still, like, nobody wanted to sit through the Sean Strickland rematch. It was, of course, the first fight between them was a war. Sean Strickland lost, then he bounced back with a very unimpressive, very boring performance versus Paulo Costa. Based off that, the UFC felt he had enough merit to get an immediate title shot. Well, actually, it wasn't immediate because there was one fight in between, but then Sean Strickland goes in there, does even worse than the first fight that they had. And he actually got a broken nose. Dricus basically danced on him all around and defended his belt. And the rest of the card, too, was just absolutely awful. Like the worst Australian fighters, bro. So, yeah. That was by far the worst pay-per-view. And that was the second pay-per-view of 2025, UFC 312. Now, what would I say is the next worst card of 2025? You know, I'm going to say, honestly, this might come as a surprise, but I'm going to say UFC 315 was probably C tier. Because, like, the main card really wasn't that good. Like, the main fight obviously ended up shaping up to be a fantastic war that ended with Jack Della Maddalena taking the belt off Bilal Muhammad, which I couldn't be happier about. One of my favorite title fights of this year just because Bilal Muhammad lost this title. He's aging worse and worse as a champion because now he's on back-to-back losses, which is fantastic. But the main card was not great at all either. You had Manan Fiorot versus Valentina Shevchenko, Jose Aldo versus Ayman Zahabi, Benoit Saint Denis versus Kyle Prepel, like a super weak main card in Canada. UFC loves to do Canada and Australia dirty with the quality of cards. So though the title fight ended up being, and I can't get too excited about a Bilal Muhammad main fight, but this, I think, was a C tier card and the second to worst card of the year, honestly. And that would bring me to the next card, which is UFC 316. I think it was slightly a little bit better than UFC 315. But still, I would say that's kind of like C tier. I mean, Pyfer, who did he fight on that card? It was like Abus Magomedov was 320. I don't know. Joe Pyfer was on the card. I think he beat up somebody. And then you had Merab submitting Sean O'Malley in the main event, but it's kind of an undeserved immediate rematch for Sean O'Malley. Merab kind of danced on him. This was Merab's second title defense of the year. And who else was on that card? It was Patchy Mix, super underwhelming, one of the worst debuts we've ever seen. Bellator fighter versus Mario Batista. Couldn't get too excited about Mario Batista. Kayla Harrison dog walked Juliana Pena. This card also was just not that great overall. With like, and that was in New Jersey. They sometimes put on good cards in New Jersey. Sometimes they give us a big main event. Sometimes they give us mid tier, but that was the deal with UFC 316, not the best card either. UFC 318. I would rank this above 315 and 316 at B, okay? This might be a little bit like, this is like borderline C or B, but I'm leaning more towards B. Dustin Poirier's retirement fight. Max Holloway went in there, pretty much put on a very decisive winning performance versus Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier had a couple of his moments, but ultimately, right, the last dance for Dustin Poirier in New Orleans in his home crowd was actually a pretty entertaining fight for the BMF. And you had Paulo Costa on there versus Romy Kopylov, Patricio Pitbull versus, what was his name? I forgot. You had Atiba Gutierrez in the prelims. What was the co-main event? Wow, I'm really this is bad, bro. Like, I'm forgetting a lot of fights on these cards. But, I mean, the card didn't shape up to be too terrible. Oh, yeah, there was, like, Kevin Holland versus Daniel Rodriguez, which was actually a really entertaining fight. It just happened to be two very low IQ fighters that didn't know how to finish. But, yeah, this card was, I think, B-level. Just because of Dustin Poirier's last fight. It was a highly entertaining barn burner fight. Max Holloway points down at the end. Poirier almost got into it, but then puts him in the clinch because I guess he didn't want to have the same fate as Gaethje. But yeah, 318, kind of like that level. Let me just remind myself like quickly who was on that card. Like I'm looking right now. Yeah, it was like Patricio Pitbull. Oh, you had Vinicius Oliveira, Paul Costa versus Kopylov. So yeah, like that's what I'm gonna go with. 318 was B tier. Now you start getting into the really great cards of the year. Next card I'm gonna put, honestly, yeah, I mean, I kind of have to put this now at B tier because like I don't think it's as bad as these cards. 313 like, but it was a little underwhelming also. But Alex Pereira coming into that fight, the first fight versus Magomed Ankalaev. Alex Pereira was going on this crazy generational run as a light heavyweight champion, ran through Yuri twice, ran through Jamal Hill to get the belt. No, defended. And then Khalil Roundtree, so that was a legendary run. But then, obviously we know how this ends, but at first, right, the anticlimactic, underwhelming performance for Alex Pereira when he lost to Magomed Ankalaev. But the rest of the card, whatever, Gaethje had a pretty straightforward defense versus Rafael Vazeev, short notice replacement for Hooker. The card would have for sure been elevated if it was Hooker versus Gaethje as originally intended. You had Ruffy versus King Green. Ruffy opened up the card with the crazy spinning wheel kick, one of the most highlight KOs of the year. But yeah, like this card, like it was okay also, like it wasn't so many crazy moments, but I gotta remind myself also, like, what was on this card? UFC 313 Tapology. Right, so you had Gaethje versus Bahamondes versus Jalen Turner. Bahamondes submitted. Jalen Turner retired him pretty much. Oh, you had Van on the prelims. And, yeah, the rest of the prelims weren't that great. It was really just Joshua Van that was pretty hype. So, yeah, UFC 313 B tier. Okay, let's move on. Next, I'm going to put UFC 321. I'm going to put UFC 321, honestly, as B tier because on paper it was great, but obviously the way it ended, like we waited so long for Tom Aspinall to get back in there after the whole John Jones saga. We really wanted him like to fight John Jones. Obviously, John Jones ended up really ducking him. He was offered $30 million, and yeah, like it ended up ending in a premature ending with an eye poke, a no contest. Didn't get a satisfying conclusion to that fight. Now Tom Aspinall's on the bench again for. You really got to feel for Tom Aspinall, honestly. His career went from borderline like skyrocket superstar in heavyweight to just one of the most tragic downfalls right now. And it's unfortunately, it's under circumstances he can't control. He had to be through the ringer with a character like John Jones, who at this point is just kind of like a disgraceful GOAT, the way he sometimes is. Not that he's not the GOAT, he's definitely one of the most skilled mixed martial artists and dominant UFC fighters of all time, but just, dude has no, like, class, you know? But then he finally gets back in there to finally defend his heavyweight title because he just wants to fight. He just wants to get back to getting paid and building up his resume. And then what happens? It's eye poke by Cyril Gane, one of the worst eye pokes we've ever seen. Couldn't continue the fight. Has to deal with the criticism that people are saying he backed out. He didn't want to continue. All that stuff, even when he uploads the doctor's reports, this and that. So ends up not even getting to do anything with, now has to wait again to fight again. And the rest of the card too was like, on paper was good, but just didn't shape out to be so exciting. I mean, Umar Nurmagomedov, obviously I don't got to get into the women's main event, nothing there, but Mackenzie Dern gets the belt, the vacant belt from Zhang Wei Li. Batista versus Umar Nurmagomedov. Nurmagomedov had a really like dominant all-around performance versus a guy like Mary Batista, who was on an 8-fight win streak. Murzakanov, quick finish versus Rakic. He's the dark horse of the light heavyweight division. And then Volkov versus Almeida. Quillan Salkild had a coming out party, like one of the craziest, top 3 craziest KOs this year versus Nasrat Haqparast. And yeah, UFC 321 wasn't like one of the strongest Abu Dhabi cards they've done, but it was slightly better than UFC 318. But so I'll say B tier again. But yeah, that's where I would rank UFC 321. Now the last few cards, as you can see on the bottom here, are all studs, absolute studs. So we're gonna put UFC 317 at the A tier. This is gonna be the next card I would say fits the bill here for number A, because International Fight Week, I had extremely high expectations for UFC 317. One of my earlier videos on this channel, I broke down the kind of card I would want to see from UFC 317. I wanted freaking Topuria versus Oliveira, Hamzat versus Dricus, Baralio versus either Whitaker or Strickland, and like Royval versus Kopp. Like, I had super high expectations, and this card ultimately didn't really hype me up as much. Obviously, it featured my favorite fighter for Topuria coming up to lightweight to Charles Oliveira, and we know how that fight ended. Topuria ended up chinning him in the first real striking exchange and continues to ascend to the highest levels of the sport. But when they first announced the quality of the card, it's like, it's International Fight Week, and this is what you're giving us? Like, it was Topuria versus Oliveira. Like, you had Kopylov versus, like, Gregory Rodriguez on there. You had Pantoja versus Kai Kara-France. Okay, so Pantoja and Topuria were the main and co-main event. But that's why I rank this higher, because the top 3 fights, Pantoja had a straightforward title defense versus Kai Kara-France. Ilya Topuria, obviously, with the crazy KO versus Oliveira, put him to sleep. And then Van and Royval really saved this card. They put on a fight of the year with this card. Joshua Van, and that's how Joshua Van, who actually, it's crazy to say, is the champion now. Obviously, it was a fluke, but ends up being the champion off this win that he got versus Royval, which really brought him into the limelight. He was, of course, fighting a lot very consistently before that, but then he stepped in on short notice, took on Brandon Royval, and became a certified legend overnight. And now he's going down in the history books as a UFC champion. Whether we like it or not, he has a belt around his strap, like, and he had that crazy fight with Royval. So that really saved the card. Dariush, kind of a boring decision win versus Moicano. Talbot bounced back strong. Then you had Kopylov and Paulo Costa, and then the rest of the card was all right. But again, just I think because of the Kopp and Royval fight, and then Pantoja with his dominant win, and then Topuria, that really made the card what it was. UFC 317 was able to become a pretty solid card, and I'm just going to put in the A tier. Maybe there's a little bit of bias there because Topuria is my favorite fighter, but next card, also in the A tier above UFC 317. Actually, before I do UFC 314, I'm going to put UFC 311 because we can't forget, right? The way this card was originally constructed, this was the first pay-per-view of the year. Around this time last year, we were gearing up for such a sick card. You had Islam Makhachev taken on Arman Sarukian, was supposed to. And Arman at that time was definitely the most dangerous fighter to fight Islam. Years before, Arman fought Islam in his debut, but they were completely different fighters then, both super young fighters. And then a very highly anticipated rematch after Arman built up all that, the record, coming off the Charles Oliveira win. That was the title fight. And then in the co-main event, you had Merab versus Umar. A lot of bad blood going into that fight, right? Georgia versus Dagestan. Merab and Umar going in at the press conference. Merab felt disrespected by Umar because he felt like he could just come in as an whatever 17-0 fight or 18-0 fighter and just think that, and like Merab like hated the conversations about Umar, but maybe Merab was secretly nervous because like Umar is one of Khabib's boys. So that's what the co-main event was, a super like intriguing first title defense for Merab. And at that point, I think the UFC still didn't really buy into Merab as a champion. So the reason they gave him Umar was because they thought that Umar would take the belt off him. They were like, here, we're throwing you the most dangerous guy possible in your first title defense and see what happens. But it ended up being one of the most entertaining fights. Really, Merab and Umar did put on. Featured fight was Jamal Hill versus Yuri Prohaska. Yuri Prohaska chinned him. That was insane. And then you had Kevin Holland versus Reynolds or Ritter as like the opening fight. Jailton Almeida versus Sergey Spivak, a star-studded card, a really stacked card to start off the year. So yeah, UFC 311 was definitely one of the most special cards, but the reason why it's not on S tier is because of that main event fight that fell through. Super underwhelming, very straightforward. Islam destroys Moicano. And yeah, if I look also, I see that Bogdan Guskov was in the prelims. Peyton Talbot had his fraud checked moment, but not really fraud check, because look what he's done since then. Peyton Talbot has 2 straight wins versus wrestlers, not even strikers, like Felipe Lima and Henry Cejudo. So UFC 311 was it was such a disappointing day for me. The most disappointing moment to hear the day before the fight was supposed to happen, that Arnold was pulling out because of a injured back, and now he's paying for it. As we can see, he's not even in the interim title fight that's in 4 weeks from now, which is absolutely absurd to say, but that's the reality. We just got to get excited for Pimblett versus Gaethje. So yeah, UFC 311, A tier for sure. Then above that, also A tier, UFC 314. Yeah, this card was a pretty spectacular card. The UFC always goes brazy in Miami. Of course, you had Volk versus Diego Lopez for the vacant featherweight title once Ilya moved up. Volk reclaimed it. Super feel-good moment in 2025 to see Volk, who was coming off the 2 straight knockout losses, to come back, the greatest featherweight probably ever, and get back his belt one more time to go on one last championship run. Beats a scary, dangerous contender like Diego Lopez. Obviously, we're getting the rematch in a few weeks. I hated it that we're getting that fight, but it is what it is. But thank God Volk said in an interview from his own mouth he does not plan on retiring. He has ambitions to fight Lerone Murphy and Movsar. So Volk still wants to put in that work. If he could really do this, dude, that would be insane. But honestly, Lopez is looking scary in a rematch. Honestly, he knocked Volk down in that first fight. But again, Volk had a really straightforward, almost masterclass performance versus Diego Lopez. Pretty much danced on him the entire time. He looked really good, and probably the leanest he ever looked for that fight, the leanest. So Michael Chandler and Paddy Pimblett in the co-main event. Paddy Pimblett, as we know, getting the title shot now, an interim title shot, off a Michael Chandler who's like 2-5 in the UFC or something like that. But Paddy Pimblett mauled him. Super violent fight. Rodriguez had kind of borderline exciting, but also kind of boring fight versus Shushu Pitbull. Had a few. He's a very untraditional striker. He does some cool stuff in between the fight. Pitbull had a lot of hype though coming into the UFC as he's probably the biggest free agent at the time that came to the UFC. So he had some hype around him. He's done okay since he's come into the UFC. You had Gene Silva, one of my favorite moments, also submitting Bryce Mitchell, absolutely dog walking him, barking over him, ninja choked him, and styled on him. Bryce Mitchell, who was talking crazy at that time of the year, just talking crazy about different things. And then Reyes was still on the upward spike he had. Before losing to Olberg, he chinned Nikita Krylov in round 1. And Prantes and Neal was supposed to be on that card, but that ended up getting canceled. But yeah, UFC 314 was an absolutely stacked card. And also prelims were pretty solid. So yeah, UFC 314, A tier. The last 4 cards of the year are going to be S tier. I'm going to start with UFC. I'm going to start with UFC. This is hard. If I had to rank these last 4 cards in a certain order from worst to, not worst, because they're all S tier in my opinion, it's right now I'm having a hard time deciding between 319 and 320. But you know what? I think I'm going to have to put 319 first. Because 319, obviously the main event, was the most anticipated hype fight of the year. Because we didn't get Jones and Aspinall, because we didn't get to Poirier and Makhachev, this was that fight everyone looked forward to. Khamzat Chimaev, the unstoppable force, versus Dricus du Plessis, who at the time looked like an immovable object, an absolute tank. Beat Sean Strickland, beat Israel Adesanya, then beat Sean Strickland again. If he could have gotten over this hump, he would probably be considered one of the best middleweights of all time. And Dricus, one of my friends is a big Dricus fan, but yeah. So the main event did not end up shaping up to the hype. It was a very anticlimactic. Khamzat Chimaev definitely outproved the doubters by going all 5 rounds, not really gassing out, just kind of having the most dominant wrestling performance. We've seen just the control time, every aspect of the fight versus Dricus du Plessis, but the rest of the card up until then was absolutely spectacular. You had Leroma Murphy versus Aaron Pico, spinning elbow finish, absolutely insane. Back-to-back spinning elbow finishes. Carlos Prates also put Jeff Neal out. Michael Venom Page danced on Jared Cannonier. Tim Elliott beats Kaya Sakura. Great prelims too. You had Bang Sangorso Sakai making his debut. Michael Zaechuk with a good bounce back KO TKO win versus Gerald Mearshart. We're supposed to have King Green and Bryan battle in the prelims, but both those fights ended up falling through. But still, the main card was a phenomenal main card for UFC 319. The only reason why I put it below UFC 320 is because of how the main fight ended up being. And Hamza Chimaev, it's super frustrating as a champion, though, because as we feared, he's going to be almost fighting only once a year now. Like, it's really, we need this guy to just rack up more title defenses. But yeah, who knows when he's going to fight Nassourdine Imavov, because now he's saying he won't get surgery, so we have to wait on him. I think Dricus du Plessis is going to fight Brendan Allen next. I strongly believe that. That makes the most sense for both of those guys' next fights. Dricus du Plessis versus Brendan Allen. Brendan Allen had a very dominant win versus Reynolds Herrera, basically made him quit. And Dricus du Plessis, obviously coming off the title, still needs a worthy, high-ranked opponent to see if he could defend his ranking. That's the perfect fight to make. And then right above that, UFC 320. S-tier. S-tier card. Pereira, probably one of the best moment of 2025 is dog-walking Magomed Ankalaev. All the trash talk and, leading up to that fight. Pereira, obviously, after the first fight, was kind of losing all of his hype with people saying he fell off. Goes in there at UFC 320 main event and completely takes that shit back from Magomed Ankalaev. Absolutely smokes him in a minute. Does a crazy shot to the side of his head, puts him down on the floor, hammer fists him with some nasty ground and pound, and then some elbows, finishes him. It's insane. Pereira's that light heavyweight champion again. Talks now begin for him moving up to heavyweight to fight either Cyril Gane or Aspinall or Jones, all three. We just got to give Pereira legacy fights while we still got it. He's ran through the entire light heavyweight division. And yeah, one of the most legendary fighters ever. One of the best, a top 5 fighter of all time. Top 10, top 7, something like that. I don't go too specific on how to rank top fighters of all time, but Pereira had generational, and everyone was saying that Magomed Ankalaev, including me, I thought too that Magomed Ankalaev was going to have even more dominant fight versus Pereira in the rematch, but then that ended up not happening, thank God. And then I switched my pick and I said Pereira was going to get him. Merab with his 3rd title defense of the year, insane, versus Corey Sandhagen. Pretty exciting fight for the most part. Prohaska always has such insane fights. Was losing 2 rounds to Khalil Roundtree. Then in the 3rd round, absolutely just goes berserk. And goes after with Khalil Roundtree. Ends up chinning Khalil Roundtree. Khalil Roundtree gasses out. He's putting it on him and then KOs him. Yusuf Zalal also is rising up to be a pretty legitimate featherweight. Makes short work of Josh Emmett with a very weird kind of submission, but gets Josh Emmett to verbally say tap, tap, tap. And then Pyfer in the opening card, fight of the main card, submits Abus Magomedov, which he also was losing the first round, then comes in the second round with a completely different type of energy. The prelims too, you had Atiba Gutierrez, Ju Sang Yu, although Ju Sang Yu lost, Edmund Shabazian. So yeah, UFC 320 S tier. Now, I think I have to put it like this. Listen, UFC 322, for the same reasons why I put 320 over 319, I'm going to have to put UFC 322 a little bit below UFC 323. S-tier card for sure. Was probably the most star-studded and stacked card of the year in MSG with Islam and Jack Della Maddalena. But again, with that fight too. And what's funny is Khamzat and Islam are the 2 probably most popular Muslim stars, and both put on absolutely dominant performances versus, the champions that we thought would be hard stylistic matchups for them. Jack Del Rio, we thought would be that guy to possibly give it to Islam. If he could keep it on the feet with his takedown defense he exhibited versus Bilal Muhammad and his elite striking and boxing, then he could be finally the kryptonite to Islam Makhachev. But Islam Makhachev just threw that all out the window. Jack Della Maddalena had nothing for Islam, and we did not see that coming. We thought we were in for a 5-round war, but Islam just goes through him the same way he did with Hamza. The same way Hamza did with Dricus. So that's how the main fight ended too, an anticlimactic, but Islam goes on to pretty much cement himself as, he already coming into this fight was a GOAT of the sport, but the greatest lightweight resume, probably greatest lightweight champion. Now he's a 2-division champion, looking to defend in a crazy stacked welterweight division. And that's also what made this card insane, was from top to bottom, this card was crazy, but like especially the main card. You had 3 welterweight, highly ranked welterweight fights with Michael Morales and Sean Brady. Edwards versus Prade's had crazy KO mode versus Leon Edwards. Michael Morales finishes Sean Brady in the first round. You had the women's super fight, of course, was the Lev and Shevchenko, but again, a women's fight. Ended up being a typical 5-round dominant little sister fight where Valentina Shevchenko basically handed it to Zhang Weili, and then Benoit in the opening fight KOing Beneil Dariush in like 16 seconds. And then in the prelims, you had Ben Sangor versus Akayev, Malcolm Waymaker possibly getting fraud checked by Ethan Ewing, who was a nobody until he came to the UFC, like steps in on very short notice, on like 2 days notice, and beats Malcolm Waymaker, who had a lot of hype. Bo Nickel with one of the craziest finishes on the card, a crazy like high kick to Rodolfo Vieira's dome to get himself a bounce back win. Yeah, this card was special. UFC 322, incredible card. And finally, to cap this all off, UFC 323 was definitely probably the best card of the year. It wasn't the most flashy card with names, but the way the card just went was absolutely crazy. This fight was an absolute war. What we thought Merab was going to do with Peter Yan for the second time to have his 4th title defense and make history ended up being one of the most entertaining fights. Peter Yan put on an absolute masterclass versus Merab, keeping on the feet, keeping it exciting. Merab didn't know what to do. Like, Peter Yan was ripping him with the body shots, making Merab literally yell in pain from body shots, put a bloody massacre on Merab's face, and just completely displayed that he's one of the most skilled martial artists in in the UFC's history. Like, and actually gets back the belt after being a champion once, losing it, by being disqualified, went on a 3-fight losing streak, comes back on a 3-fight winning streak, then now he's on 4. Like, bro, Peter Yan's on a crazy, insane arc. He just shook up the entire landscape of the bantamweight division now. There's so many new, intriguing matchups. All of a sudden, Sean O'Malley could be relevant again because he did have a very close fight and beat Peter Yan. People say it may be a robbery. That was one of the most insane fights. Pantoja versus Van ended in a weird way with Van becoming the champion. That fight, though, in the first couple seconds looked like a firefight. Tatsuto Taira with a round 2 finish over Brandon Moreno. Peyton Talbot, super like entertaining fight versus Henry Cejudo. Sends Cejudo into retirement. Bogdan Guskov and Jan Blachowicz ends up with Blachowicz in the end, turning the fight around, making it a split decision because Bogdan was on his way to probably winning that fight, but then Blachowicz came back and put it on. And every fight in the prelims was pretty much a KO finish. Like Torres with the round 1 finish, Chris Duncan with the round 1 submission after McKinney went after him. Banger fight. Fereziam massacres Nazim Sadikov. Jalen Turner with a great KO versus Edson Barbosa. Baranski and Ibo Aslan with the craziest 90 seconds probably in UFC history. Abdul Malik with a submission. Every fight pretty much ended in a super crazy, highlight-worthy finish or KO, with the main fight being absolutely incredible. I rank UFC 323 as the best card of 2025. Wow, this ended up being capped at like 35 minutes. That's crazy. But yeah, that's my ranking on every pay-per-view in 2025. And yeah, again, kind of just going to be on the slower end of putting out videos right now. I'm probably not going to drop another video until UFC 324, honestly. But yeah, guys, let me know in the comments because I want to see more engagement. I want to be able to, interact and stuff. But like, let me know in the comments what you think of my ranking system with the cards of UFC 325. And happy holidays until next time.